What's going on, everybody? I'm Johnny Brook. Welcome back to another Crafted Workshop video. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to build this bent lamination guitar hanger. So this project was really just an experiment in bent lamination. It's a process I've been wanting to try for a while, and I stumbled across a similar guitar hanger on Pinterest a little while ago. I'll link to it in the video description below, and figured this would be a great way to kind of dip my toes in bent lamination with a really simple, easy project. This project doesn't require many tools. I think you could get away with it with a jigsaw, a sander, and an X-Acto knife, and I think the end result is awesome. It looks great, it's super functional, and it should last a really long time. So hopefully you guys enjoy this one. Let's go ahead and get started with the build. The first step with any bent lamination project is to create the form. And I had some small scraps of plywood that I ended up using, but pretty much any sheet good would be a great option for making a form. I laid out the shape I was looking for with a height of about 6 inches and a depth of about 4 inches. And keep in mind that this is the profile or side view of the guitar hanger. After figuring out the shape I wanted, I cut it out using a jigsaw, and I stayed pretty much right on my line when cutting since I wouldn't be doing any shaping until all of the pieces were together. Next, I traced the outline of the first piece onto the remaining plywood, and my form needed to be wider than the final width of the guitar hanger, which was going to be about 3.5 inches, so I needed 5 pieces of 3/4 inch plywood to make up this width. After cutting all my pieces, I attached the pieces together using CA glue and brad nails, and I just made sure 2 of the edges were flushed up just to reduce the amount of sanding I had to do later. Once all the pieces were attached, I clamped them together and let the CA glue set up for a few minutes. Next, I shaped the form using my oscillating belt sander, and I purposely made the form just wide enough so I could sand it with this sander, as it really was the perfect tool for shaping the form. You could also clamp a regular belt sander to your workbench and get a pretty similar result. I started with 80 grit sandpaper to roughly flatten the form and bring all of those layers even with each other, and then switched to 120 grit to refine the curves. With the form finished, I could move on to cutting my veneers. First, I measured the outside length of the form, taking into account that curve, and I needed to make sure none of my veneer layers were longer than this measurement, since I didn't want the ends of the pieces overhanging the form and getting damaged. For the veneer on this build, I used this 2-ply walnut veneer from Rockler, and the 2-plies make the veneer a lot more pliable and less prone to cracking, which makes it a lot easier to work with. I needed to cut the veneer into strips about 3.5 inches wide, and I just did this with an X-Acto knife and a straight edge. The veneer cut extremely cleanly using this method, although I guess a veneer saw would have been the correct tool for the job. I cut 2 strips with the veneer in this orientation, and then rotated the sheet of veneer 90 degrees and cut 2 more strips. And these alternating grain directions make the final piece much stronger, and this is how the veneer layers in plywood are oriented. Once I had my 4 strips cut, I marked in 10.5 inches, slightly shorter than that outside face of the bending form, and then cross-cut the strips to length, again using my X-Acto knife. And I cut all the strips to this same length. Before the glue up, I covered the bending form with packing tape just to make sure none of the veneers got glued to the form accidentally. I also arranged the veneer layers so that the grain directions alternated, and also made sure the inside and outside faces of the hanger would end up with the walnut veneer facing out. The second ply on this 2-ply veneer isn't walnut, so this is pretty important if you want a walnut guitar hanger. Finally, it was time for the big moment, the glue up. I used strap clamps to hold the veneers in place and then added a bunch more clamps. And I'm not really sure why I didn't think about this, but creating a negative form so that I could clamp 2 halves of the form together around the veneers would have probably worked a lot better here, but it still ended up working out fine. I also used this cold press veneer glue for this project, but I think if I were to do this again, I'd just use regular Titebond 3. It turns out that this cold press glue isn't really meant to be structural, it's meant for applying a veneer to a substrate. It worked out fine since this isn't really a high wear application, but I think regular wood glue would have worked just as well. I let the glue cure for a few hours and then removed the clamps. While I'm removing the clamps, let's talk about the sponsor of this week's project, Rockler Woodworking and Hardware. I used a ton of Rockler products for this build, including their bandy clamps, glue brush kit, band clamp, and the veneer, and I'll have links to all the items I used in the video description below. Rockler's got tons of great tools and accessories for your next build, and they're always coming up with new and innovative ideas to help make your woodworking more efficient and more enjoyable. Thanks again to Rockler for sponsoring this build. After removing the clamps, I noticed there were a few areas of the edges that didn't get great clamping pressure, so I added a little CA glue to those areas, clamped them together, and then sprayed on some activator to secure those layers. And with all the edges looking good, I left the glue to dry overnight. The next day, I pulled out the belt sander again and shaped the guitar hanger, flushing up all the edges and rounding over the corners. I was actually really impressed with how clean all the edges were. There were no gaps, which was pretty awesome for my first time ever doing bent lamination. Next, I marked out the opening for the guitar. I measured a guitar stand I already have and came up with a measurement of 2 inches wide by 1 3/4 inches deep, which ended up working out great. To cut this section out, I couldn't really think of any method besides a coping saw or fret saw, which actually ended up working really well. This is one of those tools I never think to use, but it's actually really easy to control. And they're super cheap, way cheaper than a jigsaw if you can't afford a jigsaw. After cutting out that area, I cleaned up the curves with a rasp, and by the way, I finally picked up a set of rasps that I really love. I'll have a link to them in the video description below. Next, I hand sanded the whole piece up to 180 grit, making sure all the edges were nice and smooth. For the finish, I went with spray lacquer, mostly because I had about half a can left and just wanted to use it up, but it was honestly way glossier than I wanted. Still looks pretty nice, but I kind of wish I had gone with something else. Next, I worked on the padding for the guitar so that the hanger doesn't scratch up the guitar neck. I bought this bag of leather scraps from a local sandal store a while back and dug through the pile of scraps until I found some leather I thought would match the hanger well. My original plan was to have the leather run the full width of that inside edge, so I marked the piece of leather to length and cut it with a rotary cutter. I also squared up all the edges of the leather while I was at it. Next, I tried to get the piece of leather to conform to the curve with no luck, and instead of trying to have one continuous piece, I decided to cut the leather into 3 pieces and attach them to each flat face of the inside edge. To attach the leather to the guitar hanger, I used barge cement, which is a really great adhesive when working with leather. I applied a little barge cement to the back of each piece, spread it evenly, and let it dry for about 15 minutes. I also applied barge cement to the areas of the guitar hanger where I'd be attaching the leather. After letting the cement set up, I placed the leather pieces onto the hanger and then added some bandit clamps to apply even pressure. And then I let the pieces set up overnight in the clamps. The last step was to drill a hole for a screw, which I used to mount the guitar hanger to the wall. Now, guitars generally weigh a max of 15 pounds, so drywall anchors are more than strong enough, but I found a stud to mount the guitar hanger to and screwed it into place. And finally, I could test it out, and it worked great. Alright, hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. I'm really happy overall with the way this came out. It was a quick project. It only took me about a day and a half to build, and most of that was just waiting for glue to dry. But I think it's a really, really cool look. I basically made plywood myself. So I can really see this whole process being scaled up into bigger applications. I really want to get into using a vacuum bag for this kind of bent lamination because using clamps, I just wasn't really able to get nice, even pressure across the whole guitar hanger. It's a little bit wavy on the backside, which doesn't really matter since you don't really see it, but I think using a vacuum bag or something like that would get me a lot better results, and then I could apply this same technique to something bigger, something like an Eames chair or anything like that where you've got those really cool curves. I think would be a lot of fun. Also, working with that 2-ply veneer meant that I could bend the veneers without worrying about them breaking, so I definitely think I'll use those again in the future if I do more of this style of bent lamination, because I think the edges actually look really nice too with the different colors of veneer. So overall, I'm really happy with the way this one came out. I'm probably going to make a couple more of these for myself. I have a few too many guitars realistically, and I want to get them up on the wall. Got the new kid, don't want him knocking them over once he gets able to crawl around. So before we go, I want to give a quick shout out to IsoTunes, who are one of my long-term sponsors on the channel. They make the hearing protection I use out in the shop. I love their products. Their hearing protection allows me to listen to music while I work, and they're a lot less bulky than the over-ear hearing protection I was using previously. So if you want to learn more about IsoTunes, check out the link in the video description below. All right, hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. If you don't already, go ahead and get subscribed. I put out new project videos like this pretty much every Wednesday. Also ring that little notification bell so you don't miss any of my future videos. Also going to start doing some more live streams here, so the little notification bell will let you know when I do those live streams. And last, I'll have links to all the tools and materials I used in this project in the video description below. All right, thanks again for watching, everybody, and until next time, happy building.